I'm going to begin on a more personal note with our faculty members. I'm going to ask first Yehuda, if I could ask you, what does Israel mean to you in the more personal sense? Obviously, it's a huge piece of what you do professionally. It's a part of your life experience and your resume, but just in a few words, would you share what Israel means to you from your heart?
Sure, and thank you for having me here today. It's really it's a pleasure and honor to be here with both of you. It's such a hard question to answer because Israel has been a major feature of my life and Jewish identity in totally inextricable ways my whole life. As a member of diplomatic family, our family actually lived in Israel as American Jews, which created, it's kind of almost a metaphor for what it is, some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, that while we lived in Israel for 4 years when I was in 1st through 4th grade, we were there as representatives of the American government, and at the same time I was put into a public Israeli school. And so in some ways, it's a metaphor for what it is that we're doing, which is I lived with both a very proud American identity and a relationship to Israel as a central feature of my Jewish identity in ways that have always been essential and never really been that problematic. I've lived in Israel after high school, went on 2 gap years to Israel, and am running on what I think is a good personal record of 22 consecutive years of a trip to Israel. So it's always been I've always had a sensibility of being always in the right place and always in the wrong place, whether it's living here and in my many travels through to Israel, and of course now working with Shalom Hartman Institute and trying to build a bicontinental institution. I live with Israelis and with Jewish challenges in ways that are very much rooted in 2 different places and at the same time to transcend those differences.
Great, thank you. And I know it may seem obvious to ask an Israeli, Yehudit, to talk about, how personally you relate to Israel, but I don't want to make any presumptions. But simply as an Israeli, the question is answered. So share with us personally what Israel means to you.
Right. So thank you. I think that it's true. It's actually might be a contradiction or sound like a contradiction that Israel, perhaps for an Israeli, is the least obvious thing. And I think that I grew up in Israel. So Israel, like we say in Hebrew, is nof yelduti, is the landscape of my entire life. It's a physical place. It's a source for inspiration. It's a tremendous source for frustration. But also most of my family lives outside of Israel. I was born in Argentina. Most of my family still lives in Argentina. And just like Yehuda was talking about being an insider and an outsider, I think that in many ways I lived most of my life as an insider. But because I dedicate a great part of my life to working with people from around the world, I was always able to keep that angle of what is unique to us in Israel because we're Israelis and because it's so obvious to us, and at the same time what is so unexpected and unobvious about Israel. So I think that it's still, I still feel that I'm in the process of homecoming, even though I've been there for probably quite a long time.
Nice. So we thought we'd actually begin with a poem by the extraordinary Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. And it's a poem that really gets into a very deep place about not just Israel, but how to live in a country, in a Jewish community where we have many different views and many different deep feelings about what is right and what is wrong and what is, authentic Zionism, what is not. So I thought we'd begin by just hearing the poem first in Hebrew, then in English. And I'm going to ask Yehuda and Yehudit to maybe share a few reflections about this poem that is perhaps well known or maybe not, but is really one of the, I think, most powerful poems by the poet Yehuda Amichai. So Yehudit, maybe first in Hebrew.
המקום בו אנו צודקים. מן המקום שבו אנו צודקים, לא יצמחו לעולם פרחים באביב. המקום שבו אנו צודקים הוא קשה ורמוס כמו חצר. אבל ספקות ואהבות עושים את העולם לתחוח, כמו חפרפרת, כמו חריש, ולחישה תישמע במקום שבו היה הבית אשר נחרב.
From the place where we are right. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. The doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood.
So imagining that we are a chavruta, here we are with an extraordinary text, a particular moment in the Jewish calendar, a particular moment in Jewish history. What jumps out at each of you in this poem? What are the phrases or the references that speak in ways to you, but perhaps also to the rest of us as well?
What I find always striking about this poem is that I think Amichai is playing with the language of Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. He's referencing, I think, implicitly the beginning of the flowering of our redemption, which is a phrase that has been used sometimes religiously and often politically by religious Zionism to talk about messianism and redemption as a sprouting or a growing process. And Amichai, by taking the same agricultural metaphor, and instead of saying because we're in a messianic or redemptive phase, therefore we're convinced, and everything we do is with conviction, is actually saying that makes this a process we have to cultivate and nourish. And it's a process that we have to nurture, and we have to be open to the possibility that that growing is a vulnerable state of affairs that requires something different of us than what we often use.
I think that there are two things that jump at me. The first one is the play on words that I think Yehuda Amichai is doing with tzodkim being right and tzedek, justice, and how true it is, that tension between these two forces when it comes to our relationship with Israel. And I think that the fact that tzedek is not in the poem, at least not visually, but it's so embedded in every single line of this poem, and that's perhaps one of the strongest messages that is shouting at me as a reader. And I also think that the other thing is the fact that, Amichai is, or the poem, let's say the poem is, I think, most than anything else saying to us, if you want to find redemption, or if you want to come out of that very stiff place, then you need to, first of all, immerse yourself. I mean, the animal is really deep in the ground, and it's fully immersed in the process of turning over the earth. And I think that it's especially relevant to the conversation about Israel engagement and Israel education. The fact that can we progress if we're not fully immersed? Can we bring a change from the stiffest, hardest places where we experience our relationship if we're not really the same ones who are turning the earth?
Nice. So let's turn to some of the big challenges of Israel engagement, and I'd like to just sort of ask both of you to consider this. I think for too many North Americans, Israel, it's a headline in the newspaper, or it's a mythic place where we make the desert bloom, but it's not yet a core part of their Jewish identity. The question is, how can we in North America create a deep engagement with Israel that isn't only about crises and headlines and issues, but resides in a deeper place within each of us? So, Yehuda?
Sure. Well, look, crisis is like candy for the American Jewish community. We love crisis because it surfaces all the anxieties that we think motivate people to want to save something. We need crisis. I was just in a conversation with teaching this morning about the crisis of American Jews not knowing enough Hebrew. That if only it enables us to have singular solutions to complex problems. It enables us to feel that if we get out of this immediate crisis right now, everything will be solved. One of the things I've been saying for a couple of years, and I'll put it out here, is when we talk about crisis incessantly about Israel in the American Jewish community, we're making three colossal errors. We're making it's problematic because it's inaccurate. Israel is a story that is not always in crisis. That doesn't mean that there aren't crises with respect to Israel, but it's not always about that. It's unethical because it plays on, as I said, people's anxieties in ways that I think are emotionally manipulative, and frankly, it's ineffective because, well, 3 that are 4. It's been effective because people see a real Israel, and we're telling them only crisis. And worst of all, and I think this is an opening for us, it's anti-Zionist, because Israel was supposed to be the story of the Jewish people taking our own destiny of the people in our hands. And to be the paternalistic American Jews who are only passionate about Israel because what are the crises that we're going to save them from actually strips the Jewish people in Israel of their own agency. So the urgency of moving beyond crisis is not just an educational challenge. It's like a deep existential challenge for the Jewish people of what it means for us to actually wrestle with a real thing rather than something that we're always constantly in need of saving.
I think that crisis is something that is not particular to North American Jewry. I think that it is a Jewish phenomenon that for however many reasons throughout history we've always responded to and protected ourselves from. So it doesn't, it's not new to think that Israel also played into that conversation, but I think that I agree with all your points, and I think that we're missing out on 2 things. First of all, as religious Jews, Israel is part of our covenant with God. And whatever Israel becomes is what we make of it. And so I think that it's at the same time the source of inspiration, but also an obligation if we want to fully live by our Jewish values. And I think, and I use here the word religious in the broadest sense of the word, with the challenges that are inherited to this kind of responsibility. And the other thing is that I think that so I think that it's also, the second answer is, embedded in the way that you've opened our conversation today, by asking us about our personal stories with Israel. I think that that's the second thing, that when we leave Israel through the intellect or through the media or through the crises, we allow ourselves to constantly remain far away from it. So it's as if Israel is a metaphysical entity that we can only react to. We either love it or we hate it. But we have no responsibility or stake in what it becomes. I think that that's the second thing that I want to say, that it's not just a challenge, it's also, I wonder if it's conscientious choice that also allows us to opt out when things get too complicated.
Right. In there, there's there's something very timely about this, and I want to give the Jewish people a little credit, because
Give them a lot of
it's not just pre-Yom HaTzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, but in the heels of Yom HaShoah yesterday. I understand why we, as the Jewish people, are so anxious about disruption. We have to give ourselves the credit of saying, if we are dealing with the post-traumatic stress as the Jewish people of the Holocaust, that it's legitimate to still be feeling that after less than 70 years, which is a biblical term for the passage of time. It's very reasonable that we're anxious about this thing that we hold so dear, so much so that we feel that it is constantly in crisis. But to Yehudit's point, the personal narrative of so many people now in the Jewish people is not having grown up with that particular crisis. It's growing up with an Israel that is just, for whom their crises are much, much smaller in some sense, and the victories are much less elaborate. If you're not if you're not lucky enough to have lived through Entebbe, you didn't live through a moment in Jewish history that locks you into Israel in some way that's beyond anything you're ever going to experience. If you live through an Israel where it has on much shorter peaks and much more shallow valleys, then the process of engagement has to acknowledge who you are as a person, and not just this big historical destiny of, since our Jewish people survived the Shoah, therefore we're with Israel, whatever it does and whatever it's facing.
So I think each of you has, even in this brief opening minutes of the webinar, shared that Israel has a lot of complexity. I think one of the things I know that many people who are participating in our webinar are leaders of communities, leaders of congregation, who have the responsibility of engaging a community and individuals with Israel. I think as we think about all the different concrete ways that we could engage our members, our students with Israel, sometimes we think that we have to take a very, very simple narrative. we think we have to tell almost a very simple story about Israel. And we say, let's actually keep away from the complexity and the contradictions and even at times the injustices. Let's try to get everybody to really be excited and just fall in love with Israel. So the question is, can you fall in love with a complex Israel? Can you begin Israel engagement with a country and a reality that is what contemporary Israel is, which is, on many levels, perplexing on every level, I think inspiring. But can you do that? Or do we have to get back to a very simple story when we try to engage people with Israel?
I think that, Judaism proves to us that the second is, well, I don't remember if the first options you gave us was the complexity, but I think that Judaism tells us that we can definitely have a mature love and a long-term relationship with the beauty, the inspiration, the challenges, the absurd of the Jewish tradition. So Israel is another private story of a private case of a very long tradition of fighting, changing, and finding inspiration with Judaism. So that's the first answer. And the second one is about authenticity, and it's also about integrity. And I think that I know that it's hard many times, especially if you feel that things about Israel or Israeli society are making you feel that you don't belong. Then it's hard when you feel that you're rejected by something to embrace it. But at the same time, I think that we don't have another option, because it's almost how do you say lezalzel? Yeah, to downgrade ourselves if we feel that we can only truly learn to love or develop a mature relationship with Israel if it fits into our most beautiful, nostalgic or present images of what it is.
Rick, I wonder if you substituted the end of that sentence, can we fall in love? Can we fall in love with, is it possible to fall in love with a complex Israel? And took out Israel and said another human being, it would be a laughable question, as though our only loving relationships are supposed to be with those who we know very little about, right? It's possible, and maybe we'll talk about this when we get to the advocacy conversation, that there are ways in which part of our responsibility is to make Israel likable for the flirtation stage. But we're talking about establishing deep relationships. I'll try to leave behind a personal metaphor here, but I think it's valuable. The things that we love, we take seriously. The things that we love, we criticize in loving ways. The things that we love, or the people that we love, we want to know more about. I remember having this experience when my graduate studies were in ancient Judaism. And one of my students came to me who was struggling because she was an observant Jew, and she was having just the normal experience of college and encountering Judaism in college, and suddenly it wasn't what she grew up with. And she said to me, how is it that you study ancient Judaism and still feel connected to it? Like, doesn't knowing all of this stuff about what got invented by the rabbis make you like it less? And I said, the reason I study it is because I like it. And so the fact that I want to know more about it and what was done is not an act. Knowing something's weaknesses is not necessarily an act of debasing it. It's actually, in a loving framework, an act of loving it. And that's a big piece of this. A complex love, it requires actually unfolding not just the things that are implicitly lovable, but the things that are actually harder to see.
So let me also just point out for those who are on the webinar that you can, in fact, we encourage you to ask questions at each point along the way, questions having to do with the discussion we're currently having, things that you would hope that we would touch. So in the questions log, just type in your question, and we'll do our very best to not only notice it, but if we can, to answer it. Can I ask a very, very simple question of both of you, which is, we talk about Israel engagement as if we know what it is. I mean, what actually concretely do we do here in North America that that is Israel engagement? What are the whether it's educational, whether it's a series of experiences, what's the stuff in communities and in congregations of Israel engagement? What is it?
So I think that Israel engagement, in continuation with what Yehuda was just saying, is an answer to the challenge, because the underlying assumption that I see behind Israel engagement is the fact that we need to stop telling people that they ought to love Israel and build opportunities for people to find their avenues for connecting with Israel. So Israel engagement for me is wide, diverse spectrum of entry points and continuation points for people from wherever they come, with their Jewish connections, with their personal questions, with their life stories, with their interests, to find avenues where Israel, first of all, is a source for inspiration, for enhancing their Jewish identity and Jewish experience, and also an opportunity to deepen their knowledge and deepen their commitment that leads to the second part of what I was saying before about how will they become part of what Israel is and what Israel will be. And Israel education, for answering the second part of the conversation, is one of the strategies that I think that we are lucky enough to have, and it's in the process of being developed constantly, both Israel engagement as a field and specifically Israel education as a field, as a variety of long-term and short-term strategies that will help us to, first of all, introduce people to the journey and keep them on the journey.
I would put it just a little differently. To me, Israel engagement, and maybe we can map out a little bit of relationship between education, engagement, advocacy, because I think that would be useful methodologically.
Mm-hmm.
Israel engagement to me is educational initiatives and strategies to bridge what seems to me a growing gap between Israel and the set of questions that it raises and Judaism and the set of questions that it raises, and the individual identity of Jews and Israel, which is increasingly this foreign thing. Israel engagement is an attempt to stem that tide. We've seen it in our work with Hillel directors are up against this, and so in our study with them, it's actually been trying to make a conversation about Israel as rich and as real as a personal conversation or a Jewish conversation, or with social justice activists, where it's easy to talk about Judaism and justice. It's much harder to talk about that within the prism of Israel. So Israel engagement is the strategy to connect Israel, to engage Israel back through the same modalities and methodologies with which people are engaging themselves personally and engaging their Jewishness.
And I would maybe add to that one more component that, I agree with the metaphor of the bridge, but I think there is one missing component, which is the people of Israel, Israel's state and society, and Judaism. And I think that part of what's missing in that conversation is that it's either the people outside of Israel with Israel or the people in Israel with Israel. But without these three sides of the triangle, we don't really have a full picture.
So I see a question from my colleague and classmate at the Hartman Institute, Rabbi George Gittleman, who's a rabbi of Shomrei Torah in Santa Rosa, California. And George offers a comment that the complex narrative that we're talking about, that frankly is probably very, very familiar to a few of us, he says doesn't really work in his highly assimilated community, that a very nuanced, complex picture of Israel is very hard for people who have no baseline, they have no underpinning to even bring those in. So the challenge that, it may be more reflective of the complexity of Israel to talk about that, but how do you introduce people? You use the metaphor that you think about people as opposed to a country. It takes a while to get to know someone. You don't in the first 10 minutes, find out that somebody's been in therapy or someone broke their collarbone and had to have physical therapy. You just find out some basic things, where you grow up, things like that. So I think George brings us the reality that in many of our communities, it's a little bit trickier to establish that foundation upon which the complexity will more comfortably be rooted.
Well, that's why to me, all of what we're talking about is one tool in a complex toolkit. We Jewishly, in the Jewish organizational institutional world, we tend to kind of, we fixate on singular solutions to complex problems. So here you have a complex problem which is Israel and the North American Jewish community. And we could diagnose all of the reasons of how we got this historically and otherwise. But we have a lot of different solutions, and I don't think anybody's assumption is that for every population of Jews, one particular strategy has to work. Look, I learned from my colleague Ray Ringel about an effective public speaker tries to do three things, right? They try to be successful affectively, behaviorally, and cognitively. You want people to feel a certain way about a presentation. You want people to do something as a result of it. And cognitively, you want them to understand something. We do a lot that's very effective in the affective. There are programs that make people like Israel, and that's one of them is Birthright Israel. The goal is to make people like Israel more than anything else. We do things really effectively in the Jewish community around behaviors, J Street, APAC, NIF. If you care about this issue, give money or lobby your congressman or do something very concrete. What we're talking about here is in the cognitive camp. This is what I need you to understand as a Jew about Israel. And it's certainly complex, and it's not a single solution. And that should also, cognitive should also be, here's a history of Israel, and here are its people, and here are its various dimensions. But for some reason, for cognitive people and people of books, the fact that we have done as little as we've done in the cognitive dimension of what it means to be engaged with Israel as a Jewish state in relationship to Jewish people, and we focus so much on what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to feel, just means that we're just missing a piece of the toolkit. So Rabbi Gittleman is right. It can't be that the only solution to reconciling the Israel challenge for Reform Judaism is through complexity and nuance. Of course not. But it can't also be that that's the piece of the toolkit that we've missed so little.
Nice. I'd like to just sort of point out on the screen, I think you're all looking at a quote from Rabbi Dr. David Hartman of blessed memory, who not only is the founder of the Shalom Hartman Institute and the teacher of Rabbi Gilman and of mine, but really an inspiring teacher of pluralism and someone who made Aliyah with his 5 kids back in the 70s and really wrestled with what it meant to be a Zionist. And I just would offer this quote from his book, Israelis in the Jewish Tradition, as maybe a jumping off point for some of our discussion. He writes, North American Jews may enjoy inspiring rhetoric during their short visits or missions to Israel. But the truth is that Israel hasn't succeeded in bringing unity to the Jewish people. Instead, it has expressed deep divisions and a distrust, a fact that one sees clearly in the demonization of the Haredim by secular Israelis and of the conservative and Reform Jews by the religious establishment. Lots to hold on to in terms of Rabbi Hartman's teaching and by his personal example of really honoring the many authentic ways that we can learn and practice the Jewish tradition. But I can't help but reflect today, because over the last couple of days, a number of us have been meeting intensely with Natan Sharansky, trying to resolve what is one of the great painful experiences of contemporary Israel, which is the whole question of egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall. And you see on your screen two pictures. One of the classic post 1967 Israeli victory, where you have the Israeli soldiers for the first time standing at the Kotel in awe. And then you see the sort of split screen. You see Anat Hoffman and several women from the contemporary Neshot Kotel standing at that same wall, trying to find their place as a place of prayer and learning to share and to overcome some of the polarities. I think for many of us on the webinar today, it's very hard sometimes to be doing Israel engagement when you have the story of Anat Hoffman, who was arrested on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan for a crime of singing the Shema out loud, wearing her talit. And you say, how are we going to be constructively engaged in not only learning and loving Israel, but in helping Israel to become the society that is, in all of our hearts and dreams? And how do we not only become responsible for Israel and learn about Israel and its complexity, how do we help shape an Israel that reflects the inclusive values that we live here in North America? So it's a hard question, and it's been going on obviously for decades. And for non-Orthodox Jews, we struggle with unequal funding. We struggle for the recognition of our rabbis and for our, life cycle services. So, this particularly, I'm going to ask Yehudit, who just was ordained in Jerusalem, a woman, Reformed rabbi in Israel. How do we help all of us, use the challenge of shaping that Israel as an invitation to engagement, not as an experience of disengagement, but to draw us closer to work, hand in hand with those others who want to help shape that same Israel?
So I think that I have two, perhaps, beginnings of an answer, because clearly the question that you asked is it's a huge question, one of the most pressing one. The first one is actually I see Israel, again, as a source of inspiration, and I think that Israel is, what's remarkable about Israel is the ability at the same time to experience some of the most frustrating Jewish moments, or moments for us as Jewish people, like you just expressed, with everything happening around the Kotel, and as a Reform rabbi, seeing my colleagues in Israel having to constantly fight for things that other streams, or the Orthodox stream, kind of receives or takes for granted and receives as if it's rite of passage. But at the same time, I'm seeing I'm witnessing and I'm experiencing a very interesting renaissance of Jewish life in Israel that is motivated and inspired by what happens to the people when they live in a public space where the land and the time and the Jewish sources come together, and where you can listen to the national radio and listen to poems in modern Hebrew that are embedded with so many connotations from ancient Hebrew, where you're driving through places that tell part of it's a constant reminder of where we come from. So I think that that's my first answer, that the beauty and the complexity, and Amos also says it beautifully, says that I love Israel even when I hate it. And that the hardest thing about Israel is that when you have to live every day with a dream that comes true, then you are starting to see all the cracks in that image. And I think that what has been working for me, and I think that what I see working in the congregations of the Israeli movement as well, is that constant balancing between the tremendous sources for inspiration that everyday life in Israel brings us, and the fact that we still have to go. So at the same time that you have members of the staff of Iraq presenting petitions in the Supreme Court in Israel, you have another congregation that is celebrating a life cycle event, or another school that is opening, and more Israeli families that are discovering Judaism through their kindergarten experience for their child. So I think that one answer is that looking at Israel with eyes wide open, and that means to see the beauty and to see the challenge. And I'm sure that I had a second one, but I lost it in the way.
We'll come back.
I'm not sure I necessarily buy the I love it even when I hate it. I think it's okay sometimes just to be angry. I think actually it's the other way, which I think we give ourselves a break, is by being a little bit less concerned that anger is necessarily a point of departure. A lot of people get angry about political realities, and that's a continued motivator for belonging and participation, and that's okay. And even hatred is not the end of the world. I guess, look, on this particular issue, I feel very torn. On one hand, without liberal American Jewry involved, no way to this day Women of the Wall is an issue to the extent that it is, and no way anyone in Israel is lobbying and advocating for the Kotel to move from being an Orthodox synagogue to being a public prayer space for all the Jewish people. So part of me says to the Reform movement at large, if you care about issues of religious pluralism in Israel, the worst thing you can do is to get so angry that you don't participate and get involved with them anymore. That'll be catastrophic, right? What even as frustrating as it's been for years for people to be involved and not see progress, the reform movement needs, more than anything else, the active engagement of its population here in America to feel that they have a stake that they need to be fighting for. But I think what you were alluding to is also critically important. Part of the reason that this has not moved, this issue has not moved that much in recent years, or as much as it should have, is because Israelis, even when they internalized the lessons that they were actually implicitly hearing from diaspora Jews about a Jewish involvement that goes beyond simply being a citizen of a state, they interpreted in ways that were different than what diaspora Jews meant them to interpret. The fact that Israelis never really rallied behind the balloon of the wall was not because they hated religion necessarily. It's because they were finding ways to interpret religion into their public space in ways that actually were relevant to them. So even if the Kotel has become an inhospitable place to liberal Jews, the port on Tel Aviv on Friday nights has become an extremely positive place for liberal Judaism in Israel. And the disconnect is that American Jews sometimes want their liberal pluralistic values to be manifest in the Israel that they care about, and sometimes not enough in the Israel that Israelis care about. And so what would it take for us to, yes, I stay on the party line, hope for a better outcome for the Kotel, which is a place that I don't go to anymore because of this stuff, because of the tzniut, modesty checking. It's become polarizing in my family. I want that to be better, but I also want us American Jews to be a little bit more conscious of there is an Israel that is hospitable to liberal Judaism. It just might not be the Israel that we go to on Bar Mitzvah trips.
So I would just say, this has a little bit of news that I think there are signs that are very hopeful that Natan Sharansky, instructed by the Prime Minister to come up with some proposal to not only reduce the tension but to share that sacred space and to make it a symbol of unity, not a symbol of disconnection and alienation, which it has become. And I am very encouraged. There are a lot of details still to be worked out, but I know tomorrow that Natan Sharansky will return to Israel and will be meeting with the Prime Minister, and will bring the message that the Jewish leadership in North America is very much in favor of coming up with a solution of how to share that space and how to affirm the legitimacy of many different stripes. But the question of advocacy is a very key question for us. And a lot of times we think automatically that Israel engagement connects, learning and experiencing Israel to wanting to stand up and be a very effective advocate, whether it's an advocate for religious pluralism, religious freedom, or as some of the questions that have been asked in terms of peace and kind of sharing the larger geography, 2 states for 2 peoples. There's a wonderful phrase that Johnny Ariel, who runs the Jewish Agency's Makom program, which is their great work in making Israel education real. He says that we have been so busy trying to make, especially our children, lawyers for Israel, that we didn't take the first step of making sure they were lovers of Israel. We wanted to give them talking points. We wanted to give them debating training so that on the college campuses, where many of them will spend some very wonderful but hard years when it comes to Israel, they would be able to walk across campus on a day when there is, what is typical now, apartheid week on the college campus, which is a week-long bashing of Israel, that they would know how to engage and to destroy with words some of the arguments and some of the really horrific things that are said and done. And the question is, when do we get to advocacy? Is advocacy part of the Kita Aleph of Israel engagement? Is it something for later on, once one has developed a relationship and kind of a more mature sense? Can we skip Israel engagement and go right to Israel advocacy? What's the relationship? I think in North America, we're having a challenging time trying to sort through this.
I guess here's the leap of faith, is that I think in order for Israel engagement and education to be really effective, it actually has to be completely separated and segregated from advocacy. Because if you we know this from any educational environment, if your goal is a particular behavioral outcome of one way or another, your education is going to be screwed up on the basis of that. This has been the studies about Israel advocacy in the past couple of years have demonstrated that people feel that when they're being sold a bill of goods, that they're being misled. So ironically, not only does it impede the education, it actually undermines it. That's why every 6 months or so, somebody writes an op-ed in the foreword saying, Birthright Israel took me to Israel and didn't tell me about the occupation. It's almost like, wait, what were you trying to trick me with? And if you really want to be in the work of education, you have to have time, patience, and an open mind. You have to be open to the possibility that people will not advocate for your particular solutions. That's not to say Israel advocacy doesn't have a place. As my colleague Yossi Klein-Halevi says, just because he didn't want to be a firefighter anymore didn't mean that there were still not fires that have to be put out. We just have to think about them as separate propositions. To advocate for the outcomes that we want can be a mature thing that the American establishment, that the American Jewish community does with all of our political power and our money and our capability and our love for Israel, but it's not the same and it's not linear from what we educate about Israel in order for people to feel passionately connected to it.
I want to take us back to a poem by Yehuda Amichai and to answer to the question why, what's the challenge with advocacy and why I think that, first of all, it's been misused, and I think that Yehuda, your framing of advocacy offers, I think, an interesting solution or a way out of, and what I want to say is that the first thing is that, the whole, one of the challenges behind advocacy is the fact that, if I'm trying to advocate for something, I don't really care about what you think at the moment. I'm more convinced that my purpose is to change the way you think. And therefore, where you're coming from, your arguments, your questions become completely irrelevant for the conversation, and you become irrelevant for the conversation. And I think that if we're talking about a genuine Jewish conversation, that's not a kind of conversation that we should promote or contain. And the second thing is that with your framing of advocacy, I think that the way Israel advocacy or advocating for Israel at the moment is as if there is a set list of assumption, arguments that we need to completely buy into and then run and put in front of other people. Whereas another way of looking at advocacy is turning our beliefs into a behavior, a routine. But then it allows us to be critical thinkers, to learn more and to identify what are actually the messages that we want to communicate. What would the shape of our advocacy look like? And I think that that's a place where Israel advocacy at the moment is not there. And I think that that's why, our teens and young adults feel so conflicted with that. And the third thing, I think, is that, like we say in everything else in life, when we tell other people that they need to do something or they need to love something, they will reject it immediately. And Israel advocacy is telling people what they need to say, what they need to feel, and also, more importantly, making them feel uncomfortable with some questions that they have. And that's where we lose people.
We have a question from Rabbi Uri Regev, who is not simply a participant on a webinar, but truly one of the extraordinary figures in contemporary Judaism, and Reform rabbi and attorney who for many years led the Israel Religious Action Center, argued many of the most important religious pluralism cases in the Supreme Court. And Uri rightfully says that sometimes by focusing on women of the wall or issues of the Kotel, that we miss the larger issues of Israeli society that really are very alienating and, frankly, very, very distressing to the experience of Judaism and the ability to marry with a rabbi of your choosing and to go through the entire life cycle and the experiences. So he rightfully says there's a larger issue of religious pluralism, religious freedom, and he's been one of the most extraordinary not only advocates but teachers to bring a lot of us along. I want to move to a question that Bill Blumstein asked. Bill's a member of our North American board, leader of Westchester Reformed Temple in Scarsdale. And Bill asks, on a human level, how can we construct the real embers of personal relationship with Israelis and North Americans? I was privileged to learn this past Shabbat at Temple Beth Elohim in Wellesley, Massachusetts. They had 3 Israeli soldiers from the Israel Defense Forces who were there as part of their, Haifa-Boston relationship. And here these incredible Chayalim shared a bit of their story and were there to deeply engage with the congregation at all levels. So on a person-to-person level, not in a textbook or in a newspaper or even on a film, is that the most effective level of constructing Israel engagement, whether we do it here in North America or we do it on a Birthright trip or a Nifty in Israel trip or a gap year in Israel? Does it have to be person-to-person, sorting through the things that are in common and things that are different about our experience? Is that the real foundation of a lasting Israel engagement?
Absolutely.
You can't just give me a one-word answer.
No, but finally I have a one-word answer to your question. Yes, for all the right reasons. First of all, because Jewish peoplehood is the core. And Israel, I strongly believe, and this might be a theological, my theological standing is that we have Israel, the state of Israel, because we needed a project that will keep us together as people. And I think that I see it in the work that I do with shlichim, and I see it in the work that I do with teens, and the work that we do with our young adults. There is nothing more meaningful than getting to know another person and to learning about yourself through the eyes of the other person. For Israelis, that's, when I tell my personal story, that's how I was introduced into Judaism. I grew up in Israel, and the first meaningful Jewish experience that I had was in the UK in a Reformed congregation. And I see many of our shlichim who are discovering Judaism through our summer camps. Many Israeli soldiers who are discovering first positive, engaging Jewish experience through their participation in Birthright. So I think that, and not because they are at the Kotel, and not because they are at Yad Vashem, and not because they are in Har Herzl or standing by the lake at the end of Abdallah, because they have a context, and the context is human, and they're sharing an experience that is inspired by our tradition and that speaks to their big I question. So I think that I think that we don't have enough. That's the challenge. That I think that we don't have enough opportunities today, and that's the direction in which we ought to go. And going, well, I'll say something later about your comment, Yehuda, about where Israelis stand vis-a-vis their Jewish identity, and it speaks to Uri Regev. But
yeah, look, I'm a little bit less convinced than Yehudit is on this, because I think this was a rabbit hole that the Jewish community went down for a little while of the way to solve the peoplehood problem is mifgash. Let's mash up Americans and Israelis in the same room, and they'll obviously realize all of their shared humanity. When in fact, one of the things we're seeing is that, look, like it or not, the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community are different. They are ethnically different. They are politically different. They live in different parts of the world, and they're informed by increasingly different set of cultural values. And we have to be comfortable with that, right? We don't have to obviate difference in order to make legitimate a pluralism of the Jewish people, that we still care about a Jewish people that is different than our own, that looks different, and acts different, that thinks different. It's not to say that there aren't sites for meaningful encounter between Americans and Israelis and that's not valuable, but I would rather not fall down. I saw so many mifgashim happen where, since the hypothesis was let's put everybody in one room, all it did was either create conflict or create superficial relationships. What I think the driver should be is a content conversation. Because the truth is, the American Jewish community, the Israeli Jewish community, you could probably find a shared curriculum of what are the major conceptual issues facing Judaism and the Jewish people that split us or that divide us, that we're both struggling with. The use of power, the meaning of pluralism in multicultural societies. How do we figure out a way to construct that conversation with Israelis in an Israeli idiom, with American Jews in an American Jewish idiom, and once we're actually talking about something, then maybe to try to figure out ways to bridge the gap between these two populations.
So let me just we have really a few minutes left. I just want to spend the last few minutes thinking about Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut that are coming up next week, and to think about what really are the messages that we would want to convey and we would hope would be conveyed in our communities in celebrations, commemorations, classes, conversations. Israel's at a particular milestone, 65 years, to think about the maturity that comes with that, the challenges that are always present. But I would ask us, in thinking about these messages, to think about the opportunity of our movement, and the possibility, and the depth and the inspiration that could come as well from not just a reading of a prayer for the state of Israel or a few moments of remembrance, but these 2 holy days to really be catalysts for a deeper ongoing engagement that our communities could develop, and frankly that are happening in so many of our congregations and communities. I would just point out that a number of them are deeply involved in this extraordinary curriculum from the Hartman Institute to engage Israel. We have so many of our congregations that are doing that, and we're very hopeful, Yehuda, that we at the URJ will build a wonderful next way for us to both learn that curriculum and have it be the building blocks of a deeper Israel engagement in communities. So there's so much that's positive. There's so much that's exciting that's going on. And there are many communities that are waiting for that spark of inspiration. And I just would ask each of you to kind of think about what message you would want to convey, and would hope would then be echoed throughout our North American movement on this kind of Erev Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut.
I guess, Yom HaAtzmaut has a little bit more traction in the American Jewish community than Yom HaZikaron does. I'm not sure why historically that necessarily happens, but I guess this is the way I'm thinking about it, at least this year, and we'll see about what happens next year. Yom HaAtzmaut, I think, can and should continue to be a day of unbridled joy for Jewish people. I think it should be a day without problematics. I think it's not the day for a complex engagement. I think it's a Zeh Hayom Asa Hashem Nagila B'Nismechapo. This is the day God created. Let's be joyful on it. And I actually think, although I have anxieties about my Zionism when it is connected to theology, I really need for my Judaism that we celebrate modern days as we do ancient days. My Judaism needs us to be attentive to the world in that way. I think Yom HaAtzmaut should be, and I want, my kids go to a day school, and day school's best day is Yom HaAtzmaut because they just open up the courtyard of the school. There's no RSVPs. They just have 1,000 people in the community come with a big band and a barbecue and joy. It's just a day of joy and celebration and happiness. And I see it in my kids. It's one of the happiest days of the year. I think Yom HaZikaron could be, for the American Jewish community as it is for Israelis, the kind of day of reflection and aspiration. Even if it's hard for American Jews to relate to the actual sacrifice and loss of life that Yom HaZikaron commemorates for so many Israelis, for whom it's not abstract, it's my cousin, my brother, my father, my sister, so on. American Jews can relate to the problem of an unfulfilled dream. That's the core Jewish story, is what have been the obstacles that have kept us from the aspirational story. So even if it's hard to relate to the actual loss of life, and I hope this isn't a coarse thing to say, maybe for Yom HaZikaron, we at least could be acknowledging that day in our communities as the day of unfulfilled dreams, and then the radical step of making the following day of Yom HaAtzmaut the day when actually sometimes our dreams come true.
Nice.
Yeah. So, on that same week we'll be reading Achrei Mot Kedoshim, and Kedoshim to you, you will be holy, and reminds us that I think that life and death and what we do with our lives is really part of the covenant. It's part of our it's a source of inspiration, and I think that Yom HaAtzmaut, I agree with you that it needs to be a celebration. And when we say that, and Yom HaAtzmaut, and I think that we have, the way that it's structured in Israel gives you those few hours from when Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day, is about to end, and just before Yom HaAtzmaut began. And these are really, it's not just a coincidence that it's time ben hashmashot. It's that time between day has ended and evening started. And I think that, first of all, if we allow ourselves to be in those moments, and second, I think that this is the danger of Israeli society is to collapse into Yom HaZikaron and to cherish the loss and the war and the feeling of a victim. The danger is also not to forget that. and to fall into the euphoria of glory and of redemption. And if we can manage to keep those two things and remember that even those who paid with their life, they paid so that we can have a life, and that if Toshim to you, it's just a better life.
So let me say thank you to Yehudit and Yehuda for really sharing deep insights and their lifelong commitment to Israel engagement. It's not a theoretical subject for either of you. It obviously comes from deep in your experience, deep in your commitments. And I would just hope to add, for this Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, that for all of us, we would find ways to both experience the incredible joy and hope and possibility of Israel's very existence and the vitality of its society. And yes, there's complexity in their issues, but I know for me, for my family, and for so many of my close friends, Israel's at the very core of who we are. And for some people, it's not yet. But let us open hearts, open minds in concrete ways to experience Israel and to come to know its impact on our lives here in North America, and what, frankly, we can have as our impact on life in Israel, not just on the big issues, but also on the people that we will befriend and support and learn from and teach. And in so doing, I hope that this Yom HaAtzmaut is filled with celebrations, with singing, with dancing, with deep reflection, and that the day after Yom HaAtzmaut is the opportunity for us to build on that engagement and to share what we love and the Israel that lives inside of us with others. And in so doing, Israel engagement will not be a subject, but will be a lived reality. So let's wish everyone a Chag Sameach. Thank you for joining us. This webinar has been recorded, and we greatly appreciate the questions and the comments offered by all of you, and we hope that you'll share it with those in your community. Thank you so much. Todah.